Tonight, so I came yesterday. Oh, it's working. It is working. Okay, here we go. So we are up to the Mishnah on Kuf Yud Ches Omid Base, and it's the final sugya of the Masechta. The state in the Mishnah, Shtei Ginois Sual Gavzu. You have two neighbors, one who has a higher elevation, one has a lower elevation, and there's a retaining wall in between the two elevations. Let's say the retaining wall is 12 feet. So that's quite a sharp drop from the level of one property to the level of the next property. And there's a vertical retaining wall in between the upper property and the lower property. So and there's vegetables growing out of the vertical retaining wall, and they're growing horizontally. Rashi says it's talking about vegetables such as garlic and onions, root vegetables, where the vegetable is in the ground and the part that would be exposed would be the leafy vegetable, the leafy part of them. Rashi doesn't say why he learns that way, but I would say just from a practical perspective, if you had squash growing, I think the weight of the squash would just pull it right out of the ground and fall down. But if the vegetable, the weight, the main bulk is contained within the earth, and it's just the leaves that stick out, that would probably be more sustainable. To Zok to Gemara, who do these vegetables belong to? Because they're growing out of the earth of the upper fellow, the upper neighbor, but they're growing in the airspace of the lower fellow. So Rav Meir Omer Shel Elyon, it belongs to the upper fellow. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shel Tachton, it belongs to the lower neighbor. Amar Rav Meir, of course it has to belong to the Shel Elyon, because if the Elyon would dig out his property and lower its level to the same level as his neighbor, there's no vegetable anymore. Ain't kanyerik. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, if the lower fellow would backfill his gina and raise the level, ain't kanyerik, because it would be completely buried. Amar Reb Meir, each one could technically get rid of this vegetable either by digging down or digging up. Let's look at where it's nourished from. It's growing from the ground. Clearly, it should belong to the fellow who lives on the upper level. Amar Shimon says, Kol elyon yochal livshodes yodoy v'lita l'harehu shalom. If the fellow on the upper level leans down as far as he can, and he can get that vegetable, it's his. Vashar shal tachta. There's a little bit of a shaila of how to understand Reb Shimon, but I believe Rashi tells us that it's not a compromise. If it's me'ikar adin, it belongs to the fellow on the top. So me'ikar adin, he paskins like Reb Meir. However, Rashi says, Rashi beferish kedik Reb Meir. Shimon really paskins like Reb Meir, but he says shar shal tachton. Why? Because the elyon hu gufei avkur mafkalu. Me'ikar adin belongs to the elyon, but he'll be mafkrid legabei to the lower neighbor. You know why? Shegenayu loy lita rishus likanis l'seich shochaver v'lilkot. They're fighting over a garlic. He's not going to lower himself to ask permission from the neighbor who he's fighting with over this garlic to go into his property and to pick the garlic. So therefore, if he can't reach it, he'll be moichelet, he'll be mavkeret, and therefore the fellow with the lower elevation will be able to take. That's the Mishnah. Zok tehelu gemara. Amarava. The ikrai kula alma lo pligi dalin hava. The garlic that's in the ground, that's in the full property, it's not even in the airspace of the lower level tenant, surely that belongs to the Elyon. He pligi, the whole machloikis is benufoi. The part of the plant that's sticking out of the ground, that's where there's a machloikis as to who it belongs to, if he belongs to the fellow on the upper level or the fellow on the lower level. Reb Meir Sover Shodi Nufoi, Basra Ikroi, you treat the growth out of the plant as if it's the plant itself, and therefore it belongs to the Elyon. Reb Yehuda Sover Lo Yaminon Shodi Nufoi, Basra Ikroi. We do not say that it's bottle to the source where it's growing from. Rather, it's an independent item, and it's in the airspace of the lower fellow. Now, there's an interesting line now. The Odul Temayu is in brackets. The reason why it's in brackets is because the similar halacha that the Gemara is now going to quote, if you learn it like Rashi, it's literally in the Odul Temayu, it's a directly coupled situation where Reb Meir here would hold like Reb Meir there, and Reb Yehuda here would hold like Reb Yehuda there. However, Tosfos learns that they're not directly coupled. It's just trying to show us a general position that the balakarka, the person who owns the earth from which something is growing, is usually the one who it's awarded to. So let's see what the Brisa says. The Tanya we learned. What happens if I own a property with a tree in it, and I sell the tree, but not the property? So let's say Reuven owns the property, and Shimon owns the tree. And what happened was, out of the tree that I sold, starts to grow another tree. So Yotzim in the Gaza, if it grows out of the trunk or out of exposed roots, Umin Ashroshin, or if it grows, looks like it's growing through the ground, but it's really growing out of the root of the tree, but a root of the tree that's below ground level. So it just looks like a new tree, but it's really growing out of the root of the tree that was sold. Hare elu shel balakaka. Regardless, it belongs to the balakaka divrei Meir. So Tosfos' understanding of this is very simple. You see that we always give precedence to balakaka, because if you think about it, lemaisa, if you hold shadi, noifoi, basar, ikroi, these two trees that are growing out of the existing tree, the ikr, you would say, is the tree. So it's not exactly the same thing. So that's what Tosfos says. It's just a general idea that you should go basar the balakarka. Divrei Meir. Min hageza shel bala ilan. If it grows out of the tree above ground level, that will say belongs to the bala ilan. Min hashroshin shel balakarka. And whatever's growing out from the roots that are underground, so from the outside, it just looks like a tree growing up from the ground, but we know beneath the surface it's growing out of the roots, shel balakarka. So Tosfos' understanding of the comparison is it's a loose comparison. But Rashi learns it's a directly coupled comparison. And if you hold Chadi Noifei Basar Ikroi, you have to go Basar Karka. And if you don't hold Chadi Noifei Basar Ikroi, then you can go Basar the tree. How do you work that out? So let's see Rashi. But Rashi for this is on Amud Aleph. We have to turn to Amud Aleph anyway. Or actually, you don't have to turn to Amud Aleph. You just have to look to your left. I have to turn to Amud Aleph. So let's see Rashi over here. So Zokt Rashi, Ilan hayoytze min hageza. Zokt Rashi, Belokeach Ilan echod b'soich shel chaver. Reuven bought a tree in Shimon's field. The Kaimelon Bava Basra. Oh, Rashi's already easing us into the next Masechta. The Divrei Akol loy konakar. Everybody agrees that the purchaser Shimon didn't buy any land around this tree. He strictly purchased the tree. The Ilan Katna Yoyte min Ageza min Ashroshin. If another tree grows out of either the look at a tree that's above the ground or below the ground, less dina, the less dina, the kaka gemurahi. That's not even a suffix that we don't consider that part of the tree. Lagabe the shemek or chamemkar, we look at it like it's growing from the karka, and therefore it will belong to Reuben. Uminageza nami, even if it's growing out of the trunk of the tree. Rabbi Meir Savar Shadi Nufay Basar Ikrai. Rabbi Meir holds you the extra growth, you treat like the ikr, and we treat the ikr like karka gemura. I explained, I touched what Geza and what Shroshim was, but I got it from Rashi. And Rashi says, Geza kol shiroya pnei chava. Any root or part of the tree that sees light, in other words, above ground. Shroshim are she'ein roin pnei chava. Yafal gav, the shvach noif ha'elyoin labala ilam. Everybody holds that if a branch grows out of the tree, the bala ilam gets that. Hidekatani hasam, higdilu lo yishve, hasam hu ta'adaiti dahachi nochas. That's because when you sell a tree that whatever's going to grow out of it, the branches that grow out of it, shekozman sheyeh royu lasich pri yehei bekarka, it'll be in the ground. V'yisa anaf uperi, and it'll grow branches and pears. It's understood that when I'm buying, that's what I'm buying. But if it's a separate tree, for instance, it grows out of a root of a tree that's exposed, that's above ground, that's perceived as a separate tree. That's called a separate ilam, and therefore you go basar ikray. In this case, would be the karka, because we don't consider it part and parcel of the tree. So that's how you see how Rashi holds these are directly coupled. So Zog the Gemara. So we just quoted from Machloikis Lagabedina Mominus. Is this extra tree part of the tree, or do you say Shadi Noifibos Ikroi and it's part of the ground? Not only is this Shiloh relevant, Vaidina Mominus, who owns that tree, it's also Negea Lagabe Isra Veheter. With Tananami Gabe Orla, we learned Gabe Orla Ki Hai Gabe. A similar concept. You have a tree that's already mature, and the pears are no longer pears orla. And now a new tree grew up out of the roots, either the roots that were above the ground, or minashroshan, or from the roots that were below the ground. The Brisa says, Chayev Orla, we look at this like it's a brand new tree, and if it's a brand new tree, then the first 3 years that pears grow on them, and they're ulcer. Div Reb Meir, once again, this is Reb Meir's concept. Either that you always default towards the ground, which is how Tosfos learns because they're loosely connected, or like Rashi learns, it's you go basar the ikr, and in this case, the ikr is the karka, because we don't look at this like it's growing from the tree. We look at it like it's a new tree growing from the ground. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer, minageza potter, if it grows out of roots above the ground, that we will consider as having been grown out of the tree. And it's just another branch of the tree, and therefore it would not be subject to the halachas of Arla. Rather, it would be at the same age group as the rest of the growth from this tree. And therefore, potter from Arla. But if it grows out from under the ground, even though it's growing out of the roots of this tree, we consider that a brand new tree, even like Abba Isra Veheter, and therefore chayiv, it will have all the restrictions of Arla. Utrichi. Frag the Gemara, why do I need a bride to tell me Lagabedina Mominus that there's a machlekes Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda as to what we consider growing from the tree versus growing from the ground, and that same machlekes, which is really the same machlekes, it's totally the same smara, Lagabe Isra Veheter. Once I know one, I should know the other. So if I only had the case of the Dina Mominus, maybe V'hakam Reb Yehuda, there Reb Yehuda said that we consider what's growing out of the roots above the ground is considered part of the tree, and that's included in the sale that the purchaser and seller made up when they did the deal. Orla, which is not told in what you decided, rather it's a question of Isra Veheter, the Isura, maybe it would be mighty that maybe this is considered a new tree halachically legabe Isra Veheter, and we should treat it like Orla. The Yitmar Baha, and if we only knew the case that Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda were arguing, like Arla, I was Bahakam or Reb Meir. Maybe Reb Meir is only machmir to treat both these types of growths like a new tree, like Isra Veheter. It might be an Arla. Avo Bahi, but if it's Dina Mominus, Ema Moidele Rabbi Yehuda, that would be part of the sale. The Gemara Trichi, that's why the Mishnah tells us, that's why we have a Mishnah that tells us both these halachas, Sai Lagabe Dina Mominus, and Sai Lagabe Dina Isveheter. Gewaltig. Zog the Heilige Gemara weiter. Rab Shimon Omer, Kol she'el yimach lifsha. It all depends on what you could reach. Zog the Gemara. Amri devei Rabbi Yanai. Uvavach lo yanas. I'm going to ask for some help over here. I assume vach lo yanas means as long as you're not risking your life to lean down too far to reach it, it's considered yours. If you have to risk your life to lean further where you can mamish fall over, that's not considered yours. I see Avig is looking down in the art scroll. I mean, is that correct?
You use the word strain, that you don't have to strain to get it, to reach them. And the note says that if he cannot take the vegetables without straining, he relinquishes them to the owner of the lower garden. This is because he's afraid that if he takes them, the owner of the lower garden might suspect him of having illegally entered the lower garden to get them. So it doesn't seem like it's about bodily injury, but suspicion that
it's more about strain. Now, at what point will I say, forget it, let him just keep it? Okay, boy Ravana Vitem Rabbi Yirmiyah. What happens if Magia Lenufai Vein Magia Leikra? You have the garlic plant growing up. So if you lean down, you could grab the leaves to yank it out, but you can't actually reach where the garlic is itself. So Magia Lenufai Vein Magia Leikra, or Magia Leikra Vein Magia Lenufai, or what if the plant is growing down, so you can reach the garlic, but not the plant? What would be the halacha? Zoktamor taken. Now there are those who delete the second shaila, because if you can reach the ikar, of course you could grab the whole plant. It's the shaila is if you could only reach the leaf, is that called being able to grasp the whole plant or not? More end up with a taken. Okay. Omar Ephraim Safra. Ephraim the Sefer, Talmidoi Shel Rab Shimon ben Lakish. He was a Talmud of Rish Lakish. Mishum Rish Lakish, the name of Rish Lakish. Allah Rab Shimon, that if you could reach it from the top, it belongs to the fellow on the top, and the rest is abandoned to the bottom. Amru Kamedish for Malka. I said this in front of Shor Malka, this psak. Omar Lahu, and I hope you'll be able to sleep tonight because of the suspense of what Shor Malka said. But we'll leave it for the Siyam. I'll just share with you what Rashi has a discussion of who Shvar Malka was. Rashi suggests that it might be Shmuel, but we're going to see that Shvar Malka was complimenting this psak. It doesn't make sense that Shmuel would have just heard of this psak now. He wouldn't have known it. So Rashi learned Shvar Malka was a Persian king who used to learn Torah and halacha, and he knew his stuff. And he knew his stuff. He liked this psak halacha. The question is, how are you allowed to teach a goy Torah? So there's many different pshatim as to how this could have happened. There are those who hold, Akiva might like this, that you're allowed to teach a goy the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. But the question is, this is not one of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, or maybe it is. So there's a discussion amongst the Rishonim. One of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach are dinim, law and order. Law and order isn't just one law. It's a whole system of laws and order. And therefore, any choshen mishpadik shayla and how to paskin is considered part of dinim, which you're allowed to teach a goy. However, we had, and this is a beautiful Yam Shloima with which we could finish off the Masechta. The Yam Shloima says, we learned a Gemara in Bava Kama about the Roman king sent certain shluchim to learn Torah to see if the Torah is a problem for him. And they learned all the Torah, and they told the shluchim when they were going to go back to Rome to report, they told the Rabbanim, we like all of the Torah that we learned. Torah is fabulous. We have one problem. The problem is, the halacha is, if a goyish shor, shtois is a yid shor, he always pays nezek sholem, there's never chachi nezek. And if a yid shor, shtois is a goy, sure he's potter. That's not fair. That's discriminatory against us. And even though we think that's horrific, we are not going to report that back to our Roman emperor because we love everything else about the Torah. So don't worry, we're not going to blow your cover and you're not going to be in danger. So the kasha there is, how in the world were they able to teach these Romans Torah? You're not allowed to teach a guy Torah. So the Yamsur Shleimer brings down that it was a case of pikuch nefesh. They would have been killed if they wouldn't have complied with the direct order of the emperor to teach these guys Torah. So frag the Yamsur Shleimer, if it was a case of pikuch nefesh, why in the world didn't they lie to him? Why did they tell him that halacha? That if a goy shtois a yid pays nezek shalom, and if a yid shtois a goy is potter, why didn't they tell them? It's pikuch nefesh here, obviously. So why didn't they tell them that it's the same halacha as a yid? You pay chatzi nezek tam, and you pay nezek shalom whether you're goy or yid. Zok the Yamsur Shleimer, you see from here a made it finish. Legabe every halacha that the Torah says for pikuach nefesh, they were making you're allowed to teach them Torah. But to bastardize the Torah, to say in the name of the Torah a wrong halacha, that's yehareg val yava. So yes, there are certain halachas that if it's a case of pikuach nefesh, you could be mekalom. But to change the psak of the Torah, that's yehareg val yava. So you might ask, we had by Yamai HaMelech, they changed the name of certain animals. Instead of using our neves, they used a different animal. That wasn't changing a halacha. But changing a halacha, that's yehareg val yavar, because the Torah is complete and it's never going to change, and we're never allowed to change a psak of the Torah. Okay, so Baruch Hashem, we were zoicha to almost finish Maseches Bava Metzia, and now Be'ez Hashem we're going to start Maseches Bava Basra. Now, interesting enough, Bava Basra has a 176 plot. It doesn't really have 176 plot. The last daf is Kuf Ayin Vov, but since there's no daf Aleph, there's really only 175. But whenever people ask how many blatter are in Bava Basra, the answer is 176. 176 is a very important number, and I'm going to point out to you some interesting things about the number. although maybe someone can help me connect the dots. But I jumped the gun a little bit, because before I finish Bava Metzia, I also wanted to share with you a Hasidic insight in the end of Bava Metzia, which Akiva will always appreciate. And I think it's Rabbi Nachum Mendel Merivinov said this, that our Mishnah is showing a struggle between the upper zone and the lower zone. And then there's the vegetables that are in the middle. So you have Gedolei Olam, you have Tzadikim that are Dovek to the Rebbeinu Shalom, and they're Halik. Nebuch, you have people who are B'Shoel Tachlis. And then there's us, we're in the middle. We're drawn to both sides and we don't know where we belong. So what did Reb Shimon say? As long as you're within reach of the upper levels, yes, we might be in a matzav of a beinoni, we're struggling, Yitzhahara forces and pulls us, but as long as we can at least reach out to those that are greater than us, to the Rabbanim, to the Gedolim, to the Manhigim, and we can grab them, we'll be pulled up and will belong to the kat of the oilam, of the people who are going up. But we should all be zoicha through learning Maseches Bava Metzia to climb up, to be connected to the rest of them, and not that they can't reach us to miyayish and we fall. Rather, we should be zoicha to be able to reach the top. So getting back to this number 17. What's that?
Amen.
Amen. Oh, thank you. So now we have to talk about 176. So it's not a coincidence. Kapitel Kuf Yutes has 176 psukim. Parshas Nosai has 176 psukim. 176 is 22 times 8. The significance of the number 22 is there are 22 letters of the Aleph base. So by Kuf Yutes it makes sense. Kuf Yutes is according to the letters of the Aleph base, and if there's 8 psukim per ois, that's where you get 176 psukim. I'm sorry?
We just finished Afkif Yites, by the way. So that connects Bava Metzia to Bava Basra.
What is that? Kufi test is 119.
Yes, but Kif Yites has Kif Ayin Vov.
Oh,
right?
Kufi test is kapitel Kufi test. Oh, I didn't have that. Oh, that's gewaltig. So we're like doing another kapitel Kufi test. Oh, very nice. I don't. So the connection to Kufi test I understand, because the Aleph page are the building blocks of Yiddishkeit. So Bava Basra is finishing up Meseches Nezikin, which are the building blocks of Yiddishkeit. The link that I need help
Actually
with.
talking, the Mishnah is starting with building blocks.
Oh, we're also starting with building blocks. That's right. The Mishnah starts with blocks. That's fair. That's a very good point. But what I need help with is the connection to Parshas Nosai. Why is Parshas Nosai B'dafka 176? And how is that connected to the start? That I couldn't come up with. So
And
I'm
the
hoping the
building
Olam
blocks
will come
of
up
the
with something.
Mishnah.
What's that?
Beretot from the building blocks of the Mishnah, right? The Levium that are carrying this and that, and
Right.
so you have the building blocks of the Mishnah. They're carrying the Bais Hamikdash. The building blocks mit was hat sich Parshas Nusa. With the Levium that are carrying the Mishkan.
Right. So what does that do with our
building blocks and building blocks?
I hear. Okay, gewaltig. Okay, so now we will start the Masechta of Bava Basra. We'll get a little bit of a head start on this. A beautiful, beautiful daf. So Hashutfin Sharotzu Lasos Mechitza. At the beginning of the Masechta, we have Rashi, so we can chop around Rashi. Later on, it's going to be the Rashbam. Now, it's interesting to note that although we think that Bava Basra is the biggest Masechta, because it has 176 blatter, the actual blatter, the Tzur Sadaf, are not large blatter. Most of the blatter are taken up with the Rashbam, who speaks in a much longer way than the Rashi did. I believe there are Masechtas, I believe even Brachas is longer than Masechtas Bava Basra in actual words of Gemara. But the way it was divvied up in the Shas version that we have, it's 176 blot. So Hashutfim Sharotzu Lasos Mechitza b'Chotzer. They wanted to make a Mechitza in the Chotzer. Boinin es HaKoshel be'emtza. They build the center line of the Koshel will be the center line of the property line, so the wall will encroach equally on both neighbors. Let's have a look in Rashi. Hashutfim sheyesh lehem Chotzer b'Shutfis. Ubotei shnehem suchen l'soich. Both people have homes in this Chotzer, so both of their homes are open to this Chotzer. When the Mishnah, the Gemara uses a lashon of chatzeres, it always means lefnei abotamim. It's always chatzeres that are in front of houses. And that's a very, very important point, because we're going to be talking about walls. We're going to be talking about hezek riyah, my right to privacy, and depending on where you are, there's different entitlements to privacy. Like in your field, out in the meadows, there you might not be entitled to the same level of privacy that you would in your home or in your chutzner. So we're speaking about the chatzeres that are in front of homes. In those days, most of what people did, even things that were personal and private that people shouldn't see, was not in the house, it was in the chutzner. The chutzner was like an extension of their home. So be'emta zok Rashi, so let's look at Tosfos. Hashutfim. Zok Eilig Tosfos. We learned this before, that all three Bavas are really one big Masechta. Even if it was three separate Masechtas, we still need an explanation. Why is this Masechta after Bav Metzia? The Daik Gemara Bereish Masechta Shavuos Michti Hanami Makasolet. So there's always an interest into why things were set up in this way. Became proclaimers. Betray Masechtas ain't say the Mishnah. That there's a rule betray Masechtas ain't say the Mishnah, and therefore maybe you would argue that we don't need to find a segue. No. That's only Inyan to know what was quoted first, the Machloikus or the Stam, because we know Machloikus v'achar Stam, the Aloch is Kestam. The Rebbe Loishana l'Talmida of Seder HaMasechtas. Rebbe didn't always learn with his Talmidim in the same order that we have our Masechtas. And therefore, it's possible that what we think is of a achagach stam or of a achamacholikus really came first. So let's get down to our question. What is the connection from Bava Metzia to Bava Basra? We just learned habayis v'aliyah shalbeish shenaflu chaychlim beitzim. We're talking about building blocks, about kufyutes, like Reb Chaim just pointed out. We're speaking about building blocks. The Gemara called them shutfim, how to separate the debris that fell down from the bayis and aliyah. The Kataninami beis ginai zu al gabzu v'yerek b'ntayim tava inyin shutvis. So we're talking about neighborly relations, and that's how it gets into Bava Basra. Gewaltig. So let's see the Heilige Mishnah weiter. Hashutfim sherotzu lasus mechitza b'chatzer. So Pashup Pshat is, it seems like they decided that they wanted to build a wall, meaning no one could force the other person to build a wall. And that's what the Gemara is going to be discussing. Can I force my neighbor to build a wall because I want the privacy? I don't want you to be able to see what's going on in my chutzner. So at first glance, shutfim sherotzu lasus mechitza means we agreed to make a wall, but you couldn't have forced me to make the wall if I didn't want it. But since we both agreed to make the wall, then the agreement it's understood that the agreement was that Bunyan is a koisel be'emtza. Now, what do you build a wall out of? Mokum shenhaga livnois kavil, gozes kfisin levenin, Bunyan. We just finished Bava Metzia, and we just learned what these things are, right? Gvil is a different type of block. There was a gvil, there was a gozes, kfisin levenin. Like kfisin, I think, were blocks that were split in half, and therefore it's a wider wall. So depending on what the thickness of the wall is, and of course that would, of course, displace, obstruct some of the two partners' properties, whatever the norm was to build, that's what is assumed as the agreement that they're going to build. And therefore, Hakol Kaminik Habedin. It all depends on the Minik Hamedina. Gevil, if it's Gevil is 6 tvachim thick, so therefore Zen Nois and Gimel tvachim. Zen Nois and Gimel tvachim. It will encroach equally on each of the neighbor's properties. The Gazis, which is 4 tvachim, Zen Nois and Tvachim Umechza. I'm sorry, it's 5 tvachim. Zen Nois and Tvachim Umechza. Zen Nois and Tvachim Umechza. The Kfisin, Zen Nois and Tvachim, Zen Nois and Tvachim. The Levenim, Zen Nois and Tvachim Umechza, Zen Nois and Tvachim Umechza. Lefichach. Therefore, since each of the two neighbors contributed the same amount of land, as well as the same amount of materials towards this wall, 50 years later, when everybody forgot about how the wall was ever built, the wall in between two neighbors collapsed. How do you split it up? We will figure out where the foundation of this wall was. That will be the center line of that wall, will be the property line. And as well as the debris, they each get a split evenly. The same thing is in a gina. Now, right off the bat, a gina might require a different level of privacy, but the chen begina, we're assuming it means if two neighbors agree to build a wall, they split it this way. So here, the mission is giving more information. In a gina, sometimes the meaning is to make a gather, and in such a case, you could force your neighbor to make a gather even if he didn't want it, if that was the minhag. But if you're out in the meadows where there's no assumption of any level of privacy, then that's a place where we normally don't have privacy walls in between neighbors. If you want to build a wall, I want to build a wall, my neighbor doesn't want, then I could build it, but it has to be completely on my property. But I do make a symbol on the wall so that 50 years later, if it collapses and my neighbor wants to claim that it was on the center line, where it really wasn't, it was really completely within my property, I can show, look, from this wall you see that this wall was built by me and it's fully in my property. All of the building materials belong to me, and all of the land that the wall was on belonged to me as well. What if it was an Osumi Dash name? What if they both agreed to do it together so it was built in the middle? Then bonin is a koshel be'emtza, and then v'oisin chazos mikan umikan, and then you make a mark on both sides to show that it belongs to both of them, which is difficult to understand because then you don't need to do anything. And by default, we would assume that it belongs to both, which the Gemara will discuss. Therefore, if the wall ends up falling down, everything is split evenly. There's a very interesting Tosfos over here because it says Akoil Kaminik Hamadina. Everyone's big into minig. Tosfos blows that out of the water. And if you look at Tosfos, Akoil Kaminik Hamadina, we will see over here. Oh, so there's in this print that I have here, it's not a separate Tosfos, but in my Gemara, it was. So it says over here, Vim Taimar Freik Tosfos. You know, we might as well learn the whole Tosfos. We have a couple of minutes, and it's a chazara to what we learned in Bava Metzia. Begvil Zaynaish Gimel Tvachim. V'had loika Amar Begvil Vov Tvachim. Why didn't it say 6 Tvachim? And then I figured out 3 and 3. Mishum Delay Niti Lemeimar Vov Lechalechad. The Mishnah wants to make sure that we're not going to mistakenly think each side has to contribute 6 Tvachim. In Tomer Freik Tosfos, Ma'idrich Lemisni Midas Kvil V'Gozes. Why does the Mishnah have to tell us this irrelevant information, how thick each of these walls are? Even the Tana Kol Kaminik Hamadina, Kamoy Shenagu Kenyasu. Just do whatever the minig is. Why does the Mishnah have to list off all the different potential monogam? Whatever the minig is, that's what you should do. V'yeshloimar, Dim Nohagu, Yosy Mivov, Bigvil, Lo Yasa. What if the minig of a city was to leave more than 6 tvachim for the thickness of a wall of vil? You don't have to comply with the minig. That's excessive. The Mishnah trying to tell us, even though you follow the minig, not if the minig is excessive. Rather, you can stick to the shiurim in the Mishnah. However, what if the minig was to make these walls less than 6 tvachim thick? Yatsa, that you could do because you have a minig. Even if the minig wasn't even to use a block wall, but to use like a chain link fence, or hutz of a dafna would be the equivalent of a chain link fence. It was made with reeds and plants. That's a very flimsy fence. But if that was the minig, that would be done as well. In terms of the Gemara, my boy the Gemara akol kabinik hamadina lafsuyimai. The Gemara asks, what extra information are we learning from akol kabinik hamadina? Tosfos just outlined some very important information. Umashani and the Gemara answered Lasuya Asher than the Higi Behuta Vidafna. Lema, like we said over here just now, Lasuya Keminik Kol Amakoimos Kamoshin Hagu. The Dirler Benatam, and this is an important point. The Dafka Behuta Vidafna. When could you follow a minik down to a flimsy fence of Huta Vidafna? Avol Pachas Mikan. But if you wanted something even flimsier, maybe a couple of stakes in the ground, Afilu no Hagu, even if that was the minik hedjiru, it's not a valid minik. And now Tosfos goes one step further. Tosfos brings a raya from here. Rabbi Tam brings a raya from here. From the fact that you don't always go basra minik. The yesh minhagim she'ein lismoich aleim. There are minhagim that you shouldn't listen to. Even though the Mishnah says akol kaminik hamadina, it doesn't mamash min akol. There are certain minhagim that are so off base that you don't even follow those. As we know, the word minig is the same letters as the words Gehenim. You know, they say minig Yisrael is more important than din. That all has to be taken with a grain of salt and has to be assessed. Okay, gewaltig. So let's see the Gemara weiter. Svarua. At first glance, and Tosfos says that's not only going to be first glance, it's actually going to be the Mashkan of the Gemara, but at first glance we would think that mechitza is a guda. What is the definition of a mechitza? That where it says our Mishnah says 2 people agreed to build a mechitza, means they agreed to build a wall, which is how we discussed it. Kidatanya, where do you see that the word mechitza means wall? Because we learned mechitza hakera mishnifritza. We had this in Bava Metzia.
Yosy.
Yes.
The Mishnah says stone, so what else would it be?
I'm sorry. Can you speak up?
The Mishnah says it's stones, right? So what else are you building?
The Mishnah is talking about a stone partition. Yes.
And it says kaisel, right? So what else? Kaisel in the question.
I'm sorry.
What's the question? My mechitza is what do you say? It says explicitly that it's a wall.
We will soon see. That's a very good question. how could you actually suggest that mechitza can mean anything else when the Mishnah is discussing its construction? That's your question.
It says beferish. Why it's a kaisel?
Good question. That's a very good question. That's when the Gemara tries to interpret it differently. The Gemara is going to have to get around that, and we'll get there in just a moment because we're going to be turning over in just a moment. Svara my mechitza guda. Hidetanya mechitza zakerem shenifritza. Now a kerem, we know if it grows together with others royim, everything becomes usher. The kerem becomes usher. This royim become usher, and therefore, if one neighbor is planting a kerem and the other neighbor is planting zroyim, and they both plant right up to the property line, there's got to be a wall there. So, what if there was a wall and shenifritza broke down? Oimer loy gedar. We tell him to build a fence. Who is him? The Bala Kerem. We're going to have to discuss in just a minute why is the Bala Kerem more responsible than the Bala Zera. But whatever the case is, we always consider like the Bala Kerem is so-called the Roidif. He's the one who's causing the problem. Rashi says the reason for that is because a Kerem needs a big pathway with which to work. And therefore, he would have had to leave that pathway along his border to be able to work, but he didn't. He planted it right up against the wall. That's why it's his responsibility to provide the wall, because it has to protect the neighbor's property from encroachment, because he didn't leave enough space for him to properly service his care. So Omer Gadar, you tell him you better fix it up so it shouldn't lead to Klaya Kerem, and then your stuff will be also, and his stuff will be also by no. So it happened again. Omer Gadar, you tell him again, you give him a second warning. Okay, let's turn on Talmud base. Okay, gewaltig. Nisyai shemena v'loy gadra. What if the owner of the kerem says, you know what, I can't be busy with this anymore. I'm not doing it. I raise a kiddush, and therefore it'll make side the kerem and side the zroyim asurim bano v'chayev b'achbar Yosy, and we consider the owner of the kerem the mazik, and he's going to have to pay for damages. Now Tosfos tells us, what if there's a nisyai shemena? So Tosfos taught us a big chiddush, and we learned this in Bava Metzia as well, that as long as you're continuously working on fixing that together and correcting that problem, even if they grow together, because the rule is that they grow together 1/200th of what they are, they expand by 1/200, which is 0.5%. If they grow 0.5% together, they become Klayim. But they only become Klayim if they grow 0.5% with your abandonment, meaning you're not intending to correct it. But as long as you're working on it and you're focused on fixing it, it doesn't become Klayim, which taught us a chiddush. We thought Klayim means they grow together. No, it means I have a hand in them growing together, because it says Satcha loy sizra, loy sizra karmecha Klayim. It's only going to become usher with growth, of course, if and only if I'm leaving it. I'm content with leaving it that way. But if I'm actively involved in stopping that, there will be no Isur of Klayim. Okay, so that's where we got that mechitza means together. It's clear from our Mishnah that I can't force my neighbor to build a wall. The whole discussion of our Mishnah is based on the predicate that we each agreed to build that wall. What if one of the neighbors didn't want to make a wall? You can't force your neighbor to build a wall. What do you see from here? Hezek re'iyah lav shmei hezek. You see hezek re'iyah lav shmei hezek. The fact that I could see what's going on by you, that's not called damage, and therefore you can't force me to build a wall to prevent that from happening. Now, as I mentioned earlier, not all hezek re'iyah are created equal. We're talking about the level of privacy that one expects in the chotzer. We're soon going to see that kula alma moida, I'm not allowed to build a window right opposite your window so I can stare into your bedroom. That for sure you cannot do, because that's a higher level of privacy that's expected. And of course, in a field, it might be different. We're talking about the level of privacy expected in the chotzer, and for there we have a halacha, you have a right from Mishnah, hezek re'iyah lav shmei hezek. So that's the Gemara's attempt to bring a raya to hezek re'iyah lav shmei hezek. Zok to Gemara, the Ema, who said, Shnaim Shirot Lasus Mechitza, who said Mechitza means a wall? Maybe mechitza means plukta. We both agreed to separate the land. Now the halacha is a large piece of property that we're partners in. Either partner has a right to demand they split it. But what if the property is too small and there's not enough to give each side dalet ames? Then we have a right to keep it together. But and I can't force my partner to split the property. But if we both agree, that's what the Mishnah might mean. Shnaim sharatu, two people who wanted to do a mechitza. What do you mean do a mechitza? They wanted to separate their properties. Then they're mandated to build a wall, and now the Mishnah discusses how they build that wall. So ve'ema mechitza is plukta. Where do you see that the mechitza means separating property? It says v'tihi mechitza ha'eda. And now the chibun derotzu, once there's an agreement amongst the partners to split the land, automatically there's a mandate that kicks in that allows me to force my neighbor to build the wall. And therefore, Alma Hezek Riyah Shmei Hezek. Now you see that I could demand someone build a wall. I just needed permission from you to split the property. But once it's agreed that the property is split, then I could demand the wall. So maybe that's pshat in the Mishnah, and we would say Hezek Riyah is Shmei Hezek. Zok to Gemara Ihachi. If that's the case, and this is really what Dovi and Mati were mentioning earlier, Hi Sharatu Lasus Mechitza, Sharatu Lachtos Miboyle. It shouldn't say Sharatu Latus Mechitza. Clearly, it's talking about a noun. It's building a wall that they wanted. If it was a verb that they were agreeing upon, which is separating the property, it should have said Sharatu Lachtos. Since it didn't say that, it's a raya that the first shot is right. Ella, my guda. So are you saying it means a guda? Bunyan as a kaisel. Why is the Mishnah so wordy? Bunyan as a kaisel. Bunyan oisai mi bayale. If two people agree to make a wall, they build it. How do they build it? Equally in each property. Why do the Mishnah have to address in the psak they're building a wall? That was the discussion. That's how we started the discussion. Zaktimara, no, the Mishnah had to actually specify they build a kaisel. You know why? Because Itana oisai, if it just said if two people agree to make a wall, they build it. It wouldn't be specific as to what type of wall we can force them to make because we assume that was the agreement. Havamina b'mesipis ba'alma. I would have thought you could just use some stakes in the ground, and I could tell my neighbor, yeah, I agreed to build a wall. I didn't mean a big stone wall. I meant take up a couple of stakes and put it in the property so that it'll demarcate our property line. But I never meant anything bigger than that. Kamash Malon doesn't know. When someone's agreeing to a wall, it means a real wall, a kaisel. So at the end of the day, our mission is not a raya to Hezek Riyah Shmei Hezek or to Hezek Riyah Lo Shmei Hezek. We're still left in the middle, and that's what the Gemara is going to be discussing tomorrow. Raya is back and forth of Hezek Riyah Shmei Hezek or Hezek Riyah Lav Shmei Hezek. I'll just finish off with a Purim play that Heshi Nussbaum used to do the Purim presentations in shul, and I remember he once talked about a big machloikus that David Kleiner had with his neighbor Chazan Bando. Does everybody remember that David Kleiner's neighbor used to be Chazan Bando? Moti, you remember that?
Sure.
So machloikus was David Kleiner wanted to build a wall because he didn't want Chazan Bando looking into his windows. And Chazan Bando said, "What do you mean? I don't want you to build a wall because I want to be able to look into your windows." So he said the Rav Paskin using the Hashanas. One of the Hashanas is Hashana Oim Ani Chayma. So Heshi V'Taish is Oim is Rosh Tevis. Ich will machen Anaya Chayma. And then he discussed the whole Machlokes. See, that's what I remember. Purim plays from 40 years ago. Everybody should have a wonderful, wonderful day. In Be'ez Hashem tomorrow, I hope to be there in person. A wonderful day. Yes.
From 40 years ago.
So, I'm sorry?